And welcome everyone to the Mind Sculptors podcast. I am your host Callahan, and we have a great show lined up for you all today. It's it's technically the start of season 2, or the second episode of season 2, but this is our first episode back as a group here for the Mind Sculptors. We're back doing it every week, and I've got Cobblepott and Pongo joining me this week. But before we get into all of that, say hi to everybody. Just want to take a quick second to thank everybody for joining us. If you like this episode or any of our other episodes, please make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below. If you want access to our Discord server as well as some extra content, please make sure to head on over to our Patreon, patreon.com/themindsculptors, or check out the link in the description. We also have a TCG player affiliate link, which is down in the description. So if you like any cards, have any idea of some things you want to build, go ahead and click down there, and that helps support stuff like the Mind Sculptors, Nico's Angels, and the Major League Commander, which we just got done with. So with that, we're going to be talking about the history of cEDH. And joining me today to uncover our two Indiana Jones-like professors for this is going to be our resident, been here for a while, guy in Cobblepott. Cobble, how you doing today?
Doing well. Good to be here.
I really danced around calling you old there.
No, you can call
I apologize. But thank you for joining us. It's good to have you back. Also joining us today, back off of a truly crushing defeat in the MLC.
Wow,
is,
way to rub it in.
My good friend Pongo. How are you doing today, Pongo?
In my defense, I could have had it like right at the end there. If
you were a turn away for a long time.
It was literally if no one had counter magic, like literally there was like one card left in Sean's hand, and if it wasn't a red blast or a piece of interaction, then like I was getting there with Mnemonic Betrayal after having been shit on for, I would say, well over an hour. So like it was going on 2 hours because they cut to the Sheldon interview at an hour and a half into the game, and then that was half an hour, and then there was still like about another half hour of game left. So yeah, it was rough, but it was fun.
And you were going last, and for the people who didn't catch that game, it is on our channel, so you could go and check that out. But Rebel was going first, and she went what was it? It was Mana Crypt Land, Archon of Emeria, and just not what you want to see when you have a bunch of fetch lands in your hand going last.
And Charles had turn 1 Gemstone Caverns into land with, he says, he told me after the game, Grafdigger's Cage and Deafening Silence in his opening hand. So it's like you couldn't have possibly asked for your opponents to have better starts against you. if you're in my seat and Sean's seat and even Rebel's seat.
Yeah.
It's like, wow. I wish I could be so lucky.
Well, Rebel had what I would call probably one of the greatest games of all cEDH of all time. Honestly, one of the greatest games I've ever watched. But we're of course not here to talk about that. We will be recapping that at some point and talking to Rebel and talking to Ian and all those people. And also we're going to be talking to Sick Robot, who won the Tier 1 con over in Denmark last weekend.
Hooray.
So that's another Sculpty boy. Cue clapping. But we're going to be talking to them. We'll get to them here coming up. But like I said, we're going to be doing some Indiana Jones like work. We're going to be going back and looking and retracing the steps on the history of cEDH and start out this series off, which we'll be doing every now and again to just kind of talk about different topics or things of this nature. But we sent out a form and asked you guys, the viewers, to send us some questions. And a lot of you guys are pretty good because a lot of you guys sent very similar questions. So we got 6 questions here that we all are variations of about the same 6 sort of questions we got. So the first question we've got is from user Yggdrasil. Thank you. He's one of our patrons. His question is, can you trace the origins of cEDH how it came to be, and around what year and what were the main commanders. Was it Prosh, Narset, Zur, or was there a generation before them? So Cobble, like I said, you're the resident old person in our group. But you were playing Commander long before like even Pongo and I were. So really, and you were very involved in some of that old cEDH meta. So really, what was it like kind of in the olden days?
So there was a long lead up to the community called cEDH. There was a lot of activity where, I mean, whenever there's a format, there's always people who are going to try to see what they can do in that format. Right. And, even though the spirit of the format was, to have this one trajectory, there's obviously going to be people who are going to say, well, can we break this? What can we do? And really what that looked like in the very, very beginning was people taking vintage lists and trying to port them into EDH. So probably the one that's most famous is Bryant's Pile of Broken, which had it was on MTG Salvation and has been, it no longer exists, so you can't actually get access to it anymore. But it was basically a version of Pitch Long, which was just a dimmer ad nause high tide, Tidespout Tyrant deck, just looking to storm off and kill the opponent with tendrils. And that was, I think, the first step that eventually led to cEDH. Very, very early on, there was, I would say, less of a crisp cutoff between casual and what we would consider cEDH. There were people who were trying to do things that were, a little bit more competitive, and those groups were generally really small. Probably the biggest group that was around in the very, very beginning was actually Dual Commander, also known as French. And that's where I started. So that's 1v1 that takes the multiplayer aspect out of it, but otherwise retains all of the, the experience that you get from EDH with the 100 card deck, Singleton and Commander and that kind of thing. And that really established, I think, the seeds that would eventually grow to be, competitive EDH as we know it. So for me, and I suspect that for other people as well, the metagame for French was hard to participate in person. So either you played on Cockatrice, or you lived in France or Brazil or a couple of other places where there were hotspots. So it was one of those things where you couldn't really play with people. And for me personally, when there were some changes to the ban list, I switched from French over to multiplayer just to say, well, I know I can find people who are I can play against people in person and play multiplayer. So I'm going to port my main deck, which was Corridor at that point, to multiplayer and move forward with that. The question was asking about, Prosh and Narset and Zur. Those were, so Prosh came along and Narset came along kind of well into the evolution of cEDH, while Zur was probably around from the beginning. And I think that a lot of the archetypes were very, very nascent. Where you look at lists now, and they're extremely efficient, extremely streamlined. There's a lot of thought that's put to the card quality and toward the keeping your combos as condensed as possible and being efficient. A lot of that stuff was not as vital in the very early days. So you had a lot more variety, let me say, of cards that were accepted that people would play, and you wouldn't see those lists being competitive nowadays. But it was an interesting transition, over time. And I think that what happened was you have, as the community got bigger and more eyes got into it and more people were playing, the lists became, they had more people to improve them, more people to slam decks together, and the power level of everything just kind of raised all boats and everything improved. So I would say that 2013, when you had Jaleva and Marath and Prosh and Derevi all get printed, that was like a big turning point where everybody, there was a lot more to do, I would guess. There was the Moxnix Jaleva list and the Skuloth Zur list, which was both of which they were both these Storm with Doomsday piles and High Tide packages, and you had to have a certain number of islands, and they characterized kind of the fast end of the spectrum, whereas you had Derevi and Brago kind of characterizing the kind of the slower, grindier stacks kind of decks. And then soon after that you had Boonweaver Giant get printed, which you have no experience with that card, right? I have some familiarity with it. And that allowed Corridor to do some things that were degenerate at that point, because Protean Hulk, basically Boonweaver is just a poor man's Protean Hulk. And once Protean Hulk was, unbanned, then that Boonweaver doesn't make any sense anymore. So, but that, allowed, kind of another shift into kind of this, it's kind of a hybrid between, stacks and hate bears and fast combo, where they could pivot, where it could be really, fast if you get the right opening hand, or if you don't get the right opening hand, you just lock everybody down until you can find a window. And as more and more cards got printed, the metagame kind of diversified. And, as new things came out, as, Teferi got printed and, Chain Veil got printed, then, that added things that people could do that they didn't do before. And then, along came Tassiger and Gitrog and Leovold, and, Kaladesh came around with Dramatic Reversal and Paradox Engine, which blew the format wide open.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been a long road. And I think that as the community has kind of gotten bigger and has maybe found some more cohesion within itself, it has articulated itself better than kind of what it was in the very beginning. Because what it was in the very beginning was just a bunch of islands, and there wasn't really very much organization or any of that kind of stuff. It looked very, very different.
Let me ask you this, Cobble. This is kind of a question, because, we talk about organization and things like that. And I believe it was you guys with the Lab Maniacs who did attempt to get some form of a, like, I think it was probably, to my knowledge, at least, because this was where I found a lot of like information, was your Reddit stuff. Or in your Reddit, you guys had that like library of decks that you had.
Yes, that's true.
And that's the earliest I remember anything even remotely close to the database existing.
Yes. And Dan was the main, maintainer of that repository. And that was, I would say you can credit that library of information with kind of helping to proselytize the approach to the format that we were taking. And, it allowed people to have kind of a more coherent and comprehensive understanding of what people were doing, instead of, just trying to piece things together yourself and find decks and what decks are good. Having a place to go accelerated the growth of people playing in that spectrum.
I would absolutely agree with that for sure.
Yeah, I think certainly, we're looking at various points in history and like a progression, I should say, that in many ways I would say kind of parallels progressions happening just sort of like on the internet more broadly, right? Like, obviously, like very early cEDH, took place in sort of like, say, like kind of niche, like sub forums, stuff like that. And, there was not necessarily sort of like broadly speaking, a ton of people who were hopping onto the internet, trying to get information about these things. Like net decking obviously existed. And, people, even sort of like almost in like the earliest days of competitive Magic, were like copying deck lists and stuff like that,
right.
Either in magazines or, a little bit later on online. But to a large extent, I would say that, even like in 2008, there was a little bit less of that. Like to some extent, there was just less centralization of things on the internet. Like social media wasn't as huge back then as it is now.
Right.
So like you kind of see parallels with the development of the internet, development of social media, and then kind of the centralization of cEDH as a community, the development of resources that further centralizes the community and helps it grow. And kind of becomes like a beacon for more people to find it and for more people to get exposed and interested in it, to find their people, so to speak. So it's just interesting, to think about how there's certainly historical parallels with just things that are going on. And I don't know that, we'll ever like live something quite like that ever again. It kind of does.
It was a very unique time in history to be alive.
It was a very unique time in the development of the internet and the development of social media. And now, we sort of are where we're at and everything is right at our fingertips. And it's just so easy for people to get access to communities and, to end it on a bit of a downer, to get access to echo chambers.
Well, yeah. Well, something I wanted.
I was just going to say, you can kind of trace the growth of the community through the medium by which they were communicating. So, it started with MTG Salvation and then migrated to Reddit and then migrated to Discord. And as those evolutions took place, things became more refined and more crisply understood and more battle tested and detailed. And it is interesting to see how that kind of shifted over time.
Yeah. I think we'll probably get a little more deeply into that when we get to one of our later questions. But, a lot of these questions have some things in common.
One of the things that I think is really interesting in this whole conversation that we're talking about with like the centralization of stuff, how people found deck lists and things like that. Like EDH rec, for instance, didn't even exist in it. Like I think it may have existed in 2016, but I don't think it existed in like the form we know it as yet.
Right.
And that is like, I would say EDH rec is probably the resource for players.
And other content
for EDH,
like on
exactly.
YouTube, for example. Like,
yeah. Well, and I mean, and that's interesting because like, I would say Magic content creators in general, outside of like the professor, right? There were not a lot of them. And so it's very interesting how as content creation in general kind of exploded in the like 2010 to 2014 period of time, right? That's also when right around that time and right after that is when you really started to see these online communities start to pop up also. Yeah. Because I think, and this is something when we were talking about the like pseudo database that Dan kept in the Lab Maniacs Reddit is that like Cobble like said that, you know, that really pushed a lot of things around and really helped people grow and get into the community. But I think he's honestly underplaying it because like I don't mean this as because I do think it's very important to highlight the fact that I don't think cEDH exists in its current guise without the Lab Maniacs, because what you guys did pushed so much of it to this point, right? Like so much of, I mean, for the longest time, like that was the only content at all. And I think content is where a lot of people get into this stuff.
I have to object for a second.
I guess you were there too.
Resume.
My perfectly objective opinion is that I think that the way that people perceived competitive EDH early on was based on prejudice and preconceived notions, because they weren't able to see the games being played, and they basically were just acting on what they imagined it to look like.
Right.
And I think that with the Labmen and Team Turn 3 and the other early content creation platforms, what was really important to convey, and I think was successful in being conveyed, was that people can do this and have a good time and be telling jokes and laughing and enjoying each other and not getting, in a rumpus about it, So I think that people seeing that happen and realizing, wow, you can do these things, and it's also still EDH. It's still capturing this spirit of, enjoyment and fun. And these people are legit enjoying themselves in this context. I think being able to see that and watch it on YouTube, that did a huge amount of PR
I'd agree with you,
to bring people to it, because it kind of dispelled some of the myths that people just kind of preconceived.
And I didn't want to derail this at all, but when we're talking about the origins of cEDH, how it came about and how it became popular, I really do think that you guys like you have to take some credit, right? Like it doesn't exist without y'all. Perhaps it exists, but I think it wouldn't exist in the form that it does right now. Does that make sense?
Another timeline we have to.
Yeah, exactly.
Conjecture.
But anyhow, moving on. Our next question is from a user Unorthodox Bird. Thank you for your question, which is what has been the typical meta share of proactive, adaptive, and reactive decks throughout the different metas of cEDH? And he uses the example when Shimmerzer was a mains deck, were proactive, adaptive, or reactive decks more prevalent overall? Same for the Flash Hulk meta, et cetera, et cetera. So Pongo, you have seen a lot of these different metas. Mm-hmm. And what has kind of been the general share of these meta games?
Yeah, so not only have I, been part of a lot of these meta games, but I also did some research and kind of dig a little bit further back as well to kind of get an understanding.
Research?
Yeah. We did a little bit of research for this video.
Yeah. And by we mean you.
Yeah, I did a little bit of research. But don't give me a hard time or anything, right? I'm cool. I don't actually care about things authentically. So I would say that this question is a good one. We sort of have to talk initially about, where people started brewing decks that kind of had the intention of winning, right? And winning fast and as consistently as possible, which, kind of fits with our modern conception of what cEDH is, right? So like Cobblepott talked about previously, with bringing up Bryant's Pile of Broken, that would be like back in 2008. And that's certainly a springboard, so to speak, for the development of cEDH as a format, or at least that type of thinking toward deck building in EDH. The issue, though, is that when we're talking about 2008, probably well into 2011, 2012, we're not necessarily talking so much about a metagame of cEDH, right? I would say that if you go back and read even like a lot of those posts, like, a lot of those sources, the primary sources of cEDH, so to speak, people are talking, the people who post these things are even talking about how they're essentially playing pub stomp decks. And, if anybody ever wondered where like Sheldon, for example, Sheldon Menery, got the conception of like cEDH players as, pub stompers at least briefly, like look no further than like the conception of our format. And like, we should confront that fact, right? Not that it's a bad thing, not that I'm blaming anyone, right? Like you have to start somewhere. And until there's sort of organized play of cEDH, you're not going to have organized play of cEDH until you have the development of these decks and then people wanting to, not get clobbered all the time, and people being interested in playing that format in earnest. So, I don't really blame anybody for that. And obviously, to carry that idea of the format into the present day makes absolutely no sense because we have an established metagame. But, it's certainly an interesting anecdote, and you can kind of trace where that train of thought comes from in certain people's minds, at least, from a few years ago. I would say people who believe that now should probably, check out what's going on in our community a little bit more. But that's a conversation for another day. So if we're talking 2008, obviously we have like Bryant's Pile of Broken, and we have other similar decks that I would say on the whole are extremely proactive, because sort of the name of the game with brewing back then was to try to come up with a deck that was really aggressively winning fast, because that was kind of like the impressive thing to be doing. There's sort of like on some level the unstated social contract of Commander, which is like, if I'm playing with a bunch of people who are trying to play with the spirit of the format, at least as Commander EDH initially was, you're not going to go in there and play incredibly controlling, incredibly like lockdown type decks and impress anybody. But if you go in there and you win on turn 2 in a spectacular fashion, or, you like play like a million spells because you're storming off and something like that, and you win super quickly and aggressively, like that's at least cool to a lot of people. And, that doesn't take away from the fact that it's still very pub stompy, but like, that's certainly what we see initially. We see Bryant's Pile of Broken. We start to see sort of like these like very combo centric, like artifact decks like Sharum, Zur, Arkham Dagson is there as well. Zur is not really a Doomsday deck at this point because Laboratory Maniac doesn't get printed until 2011. But even before then, is kind of playing an aggressive, like interactive game, but is leveraging the fact that Zur is just utterly broken. So while it's not necessarily playing the game plan that we think of today, when we think of Zur, it's still doing something that by the standards of the time is not really fair and is quite fast, and can be tuned to be very fast. We also see decks like a little bit later, decks like Momir Vig being developed, and Momir Vig is like a fairly, an extremely consistent, just creature-based combo deck, where Momir Vig can kind of just tutor up everything that he needs. This kind of gets exacerbated to some extent when Prophet of Krufix gets printed as well, although that's not until quite a bit later. But even before then, is just going to be very consistently able to assemble creature combos, and is playing blue-green. We're talking about decks like Azami, which, interestingly enough, is probably more on the reactive side of things, in the sense that, Azami is looking to control the game and draw cards with the engine, but is still winning the game using combos, like Mind Over Matter and stuff like that. So, is obviously doing degenerate stuff as well. I would say that this early metagame on the whole is quite proactive, with like even the reactive decks mostly just being sort of slower proactive decks in a way. In the sense that they're not necessarily as consistently able to assemble their game-winning combo. Fast forward a little bit to about 2013, and that's when we start to see new commanders like Derevi being printed. A little bit before that, you have like Teferi as well, and also like Brago being printed, and in addition, a little bit later, you'll get like the Carador deck coming to be. And these are decks that are now starting to really leverage like stacks as a critical part of their game plan. Obviously, you have like prison-oriented decks, as I talked about before, like Derevi, Brago, and they're all trying to lock down the game, before hopefully executing a combo, although that part was negotiable in the case of Derevi. And then Carador, using stacks to kind of slow down some of those aforementioned very aggressive combo decks. Typically playing kind of like the Stormier plan. But still having its own fast combo as well that it could leverage to sort of be a more well-rounded deck in that respect. So this is where we start to see kind of the rise of like cEDH is like an organized metagame. And with that, you start to get sort of like a rock, paper, scissors meta of, these stacks decks playing tools to fight like the incredibly proactive decks, like, the Scion Hermit Druid deck and like the, Jaleva, Grixis Ad Nauseam Storm decks of the day. Using the tools available to them to slow down the game or lock down the game until they can execute their combo, or assemble a hard lock of some kind in some cases. And you still have some mid-range decks. You obviously still have at that time creature-based like mid-range decks, notably like a little bit later things like Yisan, a little bit later things like Selvala, green-white Selvala, as well as mono-green Selvala coming a bit later. And these decks kind of, in a way, you can treat them as, certainly a little bit more for green-white Selvala, and for Yisan as like the mid-range decks of the day, in the sense that, their game plan is going to be Mana Dork, Commander thing on turn 3, whereas like some of the faster decks are kind of trying to, like dump their hand and do something more impactful on turns 1 and 2, kind of like what we see today with the really proactive decks. The mid-range decks of the time were really, I would say, setting up more for turn 4, while hopefully having some kind of response on turn 3. Or, potentially even more responses in the case of Yisan. But, so this is where we're getting this sort of rock, paper, scissors metagame, as I'm talking about before, where mid-range is going to be naturally favored against the stacks decks, which are trying to tax the non-creature spells of the sort of proactive stormy type decks. And if you go a little bit further from that point, that's when you kind of get the second, I would say, major moment in cEDH history, organized cEDH history. If 2013 is, like Cobblepott alluded to, like the watershed moment of cEDH, then 2016, 2017 has to be kind of like the start of the modern era of cEDH to some extent. And that's when you start to see things like Kaladesh and Partners as well.
I was going to say, I was like, how's Partners not like Commander 16 was like the defining moment of cEDH.
Of modern cEDH, certainly. And what's really interesting at that time is that a lot of those decks, because of the fact that they're now suddenly helmed by generic value engines that are not in and of themselves really like specific combo pieces. Obviously Thrasios is an outlet, but like that kind of gives you direction for your deck as opposed to being like, the main focus of your deck and like a complete like top-down consideration in deck design. These decks all end up being fairly mid-rangey, capable of playing a lot of, high card quality in 4 colors, lots of grind engines. So like the meta as a whole takes a turn towards mid-range. And so this becomes a very hard time in the life of people who would play stacks decks that don't have like solid win conditions. Speaking as a Derevi player at the time. So obviously if you're playing a stacks deck at the time that can reliably close out the game, that's better, but you're still kind of having a much harder time than you used to because of, this new crop of very high card quality piles in 4 colors, with strong win conditions in and of themselves. We go forward a little bit more and we have another event that makes things even worse and gives an even stronger, I would say, impetus to build towards more proactive decks or let's say like grindier mid-range decks. And that continues to be in 2017. And that's the unban of Protean Hulk.
Dun, dun, dun.
So yeah, you can kind of see all these things happening in 2016, 2017. And this is also when a lot of people kind of start getting into the format as well.
Yeah, that was about when I started playing.
Yeah. So Flash is obviously legal at this time. So we have Flash Hulk become part of the meta. And it's really interesting because some of the earliest Flash decks were kind of inspired by Carador. So they end up being kind of like Rule of Law, Stack C decks playing Flash Hulk. And the sort of goal there is to, still be able to beat up on the sort of like fast Stormy decks, while playing a win condition that's highly resistant to stacks in and of itself. So stacks decks are just, pure stacks decks are just suffering. They're having the worst time ever because, Flash being a 2-mana win condition is very, very hard to hate out, especially when it's resilient against Rule of Law. So, we see things like Bear Weaver, if I remember correctly at the time, the name of the deck, which was, a bear deck. I might be misremembering the name, but anyway, it's a, the Rule of Law Flash Hulk deck of the day.
Right. And then this kid named Sick Robot came around.
Yeah. Well, so actually I would say even before Sick Robot, you've got guys like Siggy, who are playing like Hermit Druid piles with Flash Hulk, Flash Protean Hulk. And these
that would have been like the Lightning Druid Sliver decks, if I recall correctly.
That was also around at the time. Yeah. You certainly saw some of that in 5 colors. A good number of those decks ended up getting pared down into 4 colors anyway, just because there was not that much of a draw into 5 colors when you could have sort of better commanders.
Right.
because
and then Kenrith got printed.
Yeah, well, exactly. We didn't have Kenrith, we didn't have Najil at the time, so the options for 5 colors weren't fantastic. You know, we were playing General Tazri, not even like Niv Mizzet, rest in peace. You know, for his
who had a whole
3 months or whatever. Yeah. So that's what you start to see as far as development in the Flash Hulk space is concerned. And you see a just progressive refinement of the Flash Hulk decks, you know, constantly pushing towards more proactive. I would say that Stacks is kind of at an all-time low at this point. You know, if you're playing Stacks, you like are desperately trying to play like Graveyard Hate if you can, you know, Grafdigger's Cage. You know, you're playing all this stuff in your mid-range decks too, if possible. So like a lot of decks end up being kind of like mid-range with some Stacks elements. This is where we start to see the rise of like the man decks, the mid-range ad nauseum decks that are trying to attack on that sort of like very hateful, very controlling axis while being capable of grinding value. And, you know, as if in a flash, you know, you fast forward a little bit more and suddenly Flash is banned. And at this point, you kind of have like, I would say a vacuum effect within the meta, right?
This is only like a year and a half ago, mind you. Like,
exactly. We lived with Flash and the sort of progressive refinement of Flash decks as the meta and as kind of the major warping factor of the metagame for a good while. And I remember being there for most of it. So
it was not a good time, guys. It was a very not good time.
The dark times, yeah. So you get the banning of Flash. And what's interesting is that obviously, like anything, you know, there's it takes time for people to adjust. People weren't sure, you know, how the metagame was going to shake out afterwards. You know, so people kind of continued playing the same decks, you know, maybe cutting Graveyard Hate and stuff like that, but like not making sort of more substantial changes because, you know, we didn't really know what we needed to be attacking. We didn't really know what was going to emerge as sort of the deck to beat, so to speak. And, you know, perhaps we shouldn't have been surprised. But like what immediately kind of came back to the forefront was like those Stormy decks that like, you know, we were trying to beat, like those super proactive decks that we were trying to beat all those years ago.
And to be fair, though, that was definitely brought on by 2 specific cards being printed within that time period, which was Underworld Breach and Dockside.
Yes, like that helped.
Those 2 cards made that, like, it would have happened.
Yeah,
but
that's what I would argue.
Accelerated.
I think it would have happened even without the printing of those cards because
I would agree.
Ad nauseum was always such a major force in the cEDH metagame. The printing of those 2 cards really strongly incentivized the push towards an even more aggressive ad nauseum strategy. The existence of partners, you know, as just generic kind of like bottom up, like perfect, like, you know, like capping off your deck with just kind of this grind plan while only really or almost entirely only being concerned with like the 98 in and of itself. You know, that is another thing that kind of just, I would say, was always part of those decks. That was always like an inherent feature of those decks. If you look at Hermit Druid, like the fast Hermit Druid decks, it didn't really matter. You know, you just played a 5-color commander so you could have your combo. If you look at Jaleva, like Jaleva was, you know, you would just accelerate out into Jaleva to, you know, kind of refill on gas. Zur obviously is a bit of an exception in that respect, but like that deck was perfectly capable of operating without Zur. You kind of just played Zur as like a broken card, you know, again, kind of like a bonus, you know, to get your Necropotence out. You know, so many of these decks were kind of just like, you know, built from the bottom up, so to speak.
That's, I think, more of a factor of the printing of partners than anything else.
Right.
Where prior to partners being a thing, you have a lot of identity with the commander that you chose, where the shell of the list is very, very much married to the commander of the deck.
Yeah.
Whereas once we get partners, then all of a sudden things become much more modular.
Yeah.
And you have shells that transfer kind of seamlessly from commander to commander combination, just based on which colors you want to choose.
Right, because they're just generically good and they don't necessarily tell you how you're supposed to build your deck.
Right.
But you could make arguments, for example, that like they do incentivize certain types of deck building, but like for the most part, they're not a primary game plan. So like it's not actually crucial necessarily that you build your deck, like maximize on them, but it helps, right? And I would say that that is like a major innovation in modern deck building. I don't want to like belittle the fact that I think, for example, Tim Necrom is a great deck that illustrates how you can have synergy within your 98 and within your command zone, without playing really anything in the command zone that is like necessary for that strategy to function. You're playing a ton of fast mana that you can use to play a big 5 mana commander, but you're playing all that fast mana not because of your commander. You're playing it for the ends of Ad Nauseam and Peer into the Abyss. It just so happens that if you open with a hand that's like only fast mana, you can dump it into like a big value engine like Crom, or Tevesh Sod is another great example of that. Just like a big payoff in the command zone, but they're generic.
And I think that something that's key about that is you see those become more prominent because of their genericity. Mm-hmm. They're more common because it's stronger to have a strategy that doesn't depend on the commander. So if you're playing Gitrog, or if you're playing Najeela, or if you're playing Animar, or you're playing Brago, or you're playing Arkham, in any of those cases, the whole deck is designed around your commander being in play. And it is a big vulnerability when people can, spot remove your commander, and then all of a sudden the things that you want to do are off the table until you can get your commander back. If the strategy and the core of the deck have nothing to do with what you have in the command zone just synergizes with it, then you get a leg up because you don't have that vulnerability and you're much harder to disrupt, or it's less obvious how to disrupt you.
So this is a conversation for another episode, but I actually think, and I think that's a really important point that you brought up, Cobble, but I think that is overstated to a large extent. But again, we could have a very long conversation about that, and I would love to, but
us having a long conversation? Surely you jest.
How many questions have we gotten through?
Yeah, exactly. To get back to the subject at hand, because I swear I'm going somewhere with this. Once you remove Flash from the equation, you sort of release a steam valve that was you release a lot of the pressure that was on the Stax decks, who, previously were struggling to fight and to find effective answers to what was sort of like the dominant deck of the day. And so now what we're seeing is somewhat of a return to like a rock, paper, scissors type meta where, Stax decks are much more able to flourish. And we're seeing a lot of innovation within that space, which is really cool. It took some time for this to sort of happen again. I think that, there's always going to be, like I said, that sort of period where people are sort of stuck in the old mindset, and they have to sort of break out of their old mindset, break out of their old habits to start like exploring brewing in new spaces and, thinking about the meta a little bit differently. But I would certainly say that it feels like we have entered now back into a more balanced metagame, which is great. And
there's a self-reinforcing cycle there too, where if people perceive, so Stacks when you're playing 4-player, if you're the only stacks player at the table, your experience is very different than if there are other stacks players at the table.
Correct.
So
Yeah, absolutely.
if there's more than one, the stacks players are going to dominate the game. If there's only one, that stacks player is going to have more of a challenge to be able to overcome the rest of the table. So when people see, so when stacks is a very small part of the metagame, and people only see one person playing stacks at a time, they see stacks kind of in its poorest light. So they aren't encouraged to go in and try that strategy. Whereas if people would do so, then stacks, I think, would dominate because.
Well, think about even like Pongo's game in the playoffs, right? Like that was a game where you had two stacks decks sitting bookended from each other, right?
Right.
And it was a really good example of you have a very good combo finishing, two very good combo finishing stacks decks, and you got to see them kind of interact with each other with that crazy, that insane all in play that Rebel had, right, to sack her board to stop Charles from winning. That really highlights what you're talking about, honestly, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think it's an issue of inertia fundamentally, right? It's,
yes.
People kind of, it takes a little bit of time for them to change the course that they're sort of already on.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I guess that sort of brings us up to the modern day, where I would say that, we kind of like went through periods of, relative, like relative highs in terms of proactive decks to relative lows in terms of, reactive decks to sort of a more balanced approach that we see today. Some people would argue that, we have like a lot more proactive decks these days. I would argue that we just have decks that are like far more efficient, far better at executing their plan. Even the stacks decks for the most part are much better at even executing their plans than they used to be in terms of closing out the game eventually. So just an overall improvement in deck building, I would say, across the board.
Yeah.
But still more of a balance on the whole, in terms of, adaptive or proactive and reactive type of decks.
Right. Well, our next question is from our good friend Ken Bauman. Ken, thank you for submitting this question. It's a multi-parted question. I'm going to direct this at Cobble initially. Ken asks, how did early competitive EDH players think about themselves and their decks? Did they consider themselves part of a fringe within a larger community or part of a spectrum of playstyles inherent in Commander? What language did they use to describe themselves and their decks?
Okay, so there's a couple of questions that are being asked there. And I think where I'll start is cEDH is and has been EDH since the beginning. And it's always been an expression of people playing EDH. And originally, there was no cEDH Reddit. There was no, competitive EDH subreddit. Everybody was part of the EDH Reddit. And you would have people who would post and say, hey, I'm trying this, and I'm just seeing how far I can push this. What do you guys think? And there would be these religious wars that would take place, and it became extremely toxic. And eventually, the people who were pursuing EDH in a competitive mindset wound up just kind of retreating to a different space where they could be able to collaborate and talk without having people telling them that they're doing it wrong. So that's kind of the impetus for when Shake and Shimmy created the competitive EDH subreddit. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the first point of distinction when people began to consider themselves something that isn't different from EDH, but something that is distinct within EDH. So we're part of I like the language that Ken uses where he says, part of, a spectrum. That, you can't say what everybody has in their mind because we don't know, you only know what you're thinking. But there have always been people who have considered the community part of a spectrum. There's other people who consider the community part of a fringe group that should separate and so on. I think that the language that has been used definitely has caused some problems over the years where, so for instance, the Bryant's Pile of Broken, that thread, which no longer exists, actually had a really good sequence of interactions where somebody said, that's odd. This seems like it kind of maybe goes against what people are supposed to be doing in EDH. And then Brian's response was, I don't care if other people are having fun. I want to have fun. And then somebody responded to that by saying, well, I like to play it like that as long as everybody at the table is playing it like that. And there in 2008, you have, your core EDH demographic, you have a pub stomper, and you have somebody who wants to play against, evenly matched decks.
Yeah.
So
the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Right. Yeah. But like Pongo was saying before, while cEDH was becoming a thing, it wasn't separate. So the way that people tried out their decks and played those decks and tested those decks was kind of in the wild. Right. And there wasn't consistent language because I don't think that there was a consistent mindset at this point.
And there wasn't a core community yet, right?
That community didn't exist. So we couldn't have a kind of central theme that everybody is rallying around. So there were plenty of people that were saying, well, I just want to kick your ass. And that was associated with cEDH because, well, this person is being competitive and that's what cEDH is. And, you had other people who, hey, we're doing a tournament and we want everybody to, you can use proxies and we can, play whatever deck you want and no holds barred. And let's see who can win. Those are two different mindsets, but those, I think, awareness, and I don't think self-awareness around those two different mindsets became a thing until very recently. And
that is in no small part due to the conversations that have constantly been going on, probably honestly in my mind since around the Paradox Engine banning, right?
The Paradox Engine banning was useful in helping to communicate the different trajectories that the communities have. So Paradox Engine being very unhealthy for EDH, but being perfectly fine for cEDH, helped people to communicate, especially to people in the CAG and the RC, to be able to communicate what the goal of cEDH is. And it gave a concrete example for how to articulate that. And as those things crystallized, our language was able to adjust, and people, the widespread opinion of what cEDH was became less confused. And there's still a long way to go, but I think
God, it's so much better than it was 2 years ago.
Things have there's been a lot of intentional discussion taking place. The RC has done a lot to be accommodating and to thoughtfully listen, and the wider community, I think, has become more accepting as well. And those things, it's good to see, because it's healthier for everybody. And I think that's why, one of the reasons why you're seeing cEDH get bigger.
Yeah, it's really exploded specifically over the last year. Just as far as like, there's so many new people playing the game. There's tons of new content creation groups. There's just so much more of it now than I feel like there ever was. I mean, before the Flash banning, it just feels so much bigger than it ever did before, to me at least.
Well, I think objectively it is, right? Like it's kind of, we were talking about this before we hit the record buttons, but if you look at the cEDH subreddit as sort of like a metric in some way reflecting the size of the community, because in some ways, that subreddit was sort of where your organized community began. Right. Within like the first few years, you have a group of a few hundred people. You fast forward to 2016, and we're celebrating in a post like 5,000 members in the subreddit, which is really not very many. If you think about like, the larger EDH subreddit or like the larger Magic subreddits, you're talking about easily, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. Right. But then if you continue fast forwarding a few years, up until today, if you look at the cEDH subreddit, you're talking over 50,000 people. So you've got a tenfold, you go from like an increase of a few thousand to a tenfold increase within a pretty similar time frame, right? So it's kind of just been like, like skyrocketing in the amount of engagement within that subreddit and the amount of people that are interested in the format. And, this is reflected too with the sort of expansion of Discord as sort of like now the main place, I would say, that cEDH discourse kind of takes place.
And not only that, though, but like the explosion of successful cEDH content creation groups, right? Like specifically, you think about Play to Win and Playing with Power, which both kind of came up around the same period of time, right? Is all just like they existed the year before Flash, but just so big. And I remember specifically when Ryan went on the professor's what is the podcast he does to talk about Flash and what cEDH was and all those things. And I think Brian had a really good point where he was discussing where the idea that cEDH now is just a small fraction of the community. And then you look at the sub count on channels like Playing with Power and Play to Win and those sorts of things. And he's just like, mathematically, that just is not true. And, now you can even look at the r/cEDH server and how many people are there and how many posts are there and the amount of engagement and how quickly cEDH content thrives right now. Just honestly just shows how many people, like, the desire for this stuff is there, and it's real and it's palpable.
Yeah. It's not like back in 2013 where, cEDH was like 20 people. It's like, a few hundred people. One of which is just Lurker posting his 300th Gave brew, and people talking about Kalia.
it's very interesting. I know I brought up Dan's like little like archive that he had on Reddit, but man, I had that pinned on my Chrome bar all the way up until like last year. Because I'd still go back and look at it every now and again. And even now I go back and I'll just like pull up those lists to just get ideas, right? Because there's still stuff there to mine.
Yeah.
But it's wild to me because it feels like it was so long ago. But it's just a few years ago. And that just kind of shows how rapidly this is all like happened over the last like 5 years, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Since Partners.
Really, yeah.
Like a major, I would say, like point of focus for like when the format really started taking off.
Yeah.
And I think you're right to highlight the fact that the content creators definitely had a big role to play in that. Whether it was Lab Maniacs, but also I think Playing with Power being like one of the, if not the first cEDH content creation group to like hit 10,000 subscribers, and they did it like
in
they
no
sped
time.
run it. Yeah, exactly. Because they kind of they have a great formula for gameplay.
The spike feeders might have gotten there first, but
it's much more slowly. It took them more time. Yeah, I'm not sure who got there first, but I know that Playing with Power got there extremely fast.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all very interesting. And I know we're about to reach our 4,000 mark, which is exciting. Still haven't gotten Phoenix's 3,000 subscriber video stuff yet.
I mean, I feel like we should have given up on that a while ago at this point.
We've already given up on it, but I'm going to bitch and moan about it till the day I die. So our next question is going to be directed at Pongo. It is from user DJ Yavamaya. And they ask, I was wondering if you could talk about the history of Stasis in cEDH. So Pongo, you play a little deck called Derevi, right?
Yep.
Could you tell us? Could you tell us about Stasis and cEDH and how that has evolved and whatnot?
Yeah, it's funny that this question's coming from DJ, and I shouldn't be surprised because DJ plays Yorn or Jorn. I am not even sure how to pronounce it because if I'm being honest, like I've played against the deck once in my life. But obviously that's kind of like, I would say the last holdout of Stasis perhaps in cEDH. So interestingly enough, Stasis doesn't start with Derevi in cEDH as much as, that's certainly one of the ones that comes to mind. And it's one of the first, I would say, big places. And it might be the first, like, let's say, properly cEDH deck where it saw play. But the earliest, the earliest place that I found that made reference to playing Stasis was actually in old Xur builds, which is pretty interesting.
Really? Interesting.
Well, because it makes sense because Xur can tutor it, right? And so Xur was like an enchantment toolbox deck back then with Necropotence as kind of like a broken draw engine. But I suppose the idea was you would search up an enchantment that gave Xur vigilance, and then you would get Stasis to kind of just like lock everyone out. And meanwhile, you're kind of just going off with Xur. You don't really have to cast spells. So you can maintain Stasis for a really long time because Xur is going to just, break parity on it by finding you an enchantment each time. If not finding you something that is going to sort of net you resources directly through the Stasis. But, I think probably the idea with the Stasis there was to lock people out long enough that you could find that enchantment that makes Xur really, really large based on the size of your hand, based on the number of cards you have in hand. Then using Necropotence, you kind of just keep your hand topped off and you're kind of just picking people off that way. That was a deck back in the day that was feared, interestingly enough.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that was one of the earliest mentions of Stasis that I could find. And then, going forward from there, I would say there's not really like a ton of dedicated sort of stasis decks until we get to 2013 with Derevi. Like some decks might have been playing stasis just kind of as like a tempo piece. I'm sure people tried it out in Grand Arbiter Augustin, which was like one of the early sort of stacksy decks that people experimented with before it became more of a controlling style of deck. So I'm sure people just kind of jammed it in there and, wouldn't necessarily maintain it forever, but would use it to prolong the game long enough to set up some other things. But, once Derevi comes around, then you actually start seeing people, building decks. And sorry, I should say Brago as well, because that's a little bit before Derevi. Brago is probably, the best commander at the time for breaking parity with stasis because he just does it so naturally by untapping mana sources, untapping himself. That, even Derevi did not break parity on stasis nearly as well as Brago. So Brago probably one of like the earliest and best like stasis decks, along with like Static Orb and Winter Orb, sort of like really prison-y style of decks. Then there's Derevi, which, played stasis to have, enough density of prison effects, but was still obviously reliant on having another piece to really break parity or to maintain it, I should say. So Derevi could play it to slow down the game without another piece, but, was ideally looking to set up hard locks. So if you were going to play out stasis, you really wanted to have, your Quirion Ranger or your Sakashima or, even your Copperhorn Scout. Cobblepot's probably remembering all these cards, as I lift them off. Your
Sakashima.
Yeah. your second Derevi. And yeah, so using those cards, you're essentially able to maintain stasis indefinitely. And, that deck would try to not just maintain stasis indefinitely, but also thrive under it. So at a certain point, you're playing more and more creatures out while you have the stasis active, such that you can now start tapping your opponent's stuff down while your stasis is out. So, you essentially put them in this perpetual lock. And then, you get a Trinisphere out and suddenly it's like, wait, I can only play one land per turn, but everything costs 3 and you're tapping my land down. What? and then that's when, the gears start spinning in their head and they're like, oh, you've won. Okay. I see how it is. So, that usually gets people to scoop. So yeah, I would say Derevi for a very long time was playing stasis, even if it wasn't necessarily always the easiest thing to pull off in practice. Then moving forward a year to Commander 2014, that's when we get Teferi. And Teferi is another potent stasis enabler, the Planeswalker Teferi, because he can come into play and start untapping a bunch of permanents so you can maintain stasis indefinitely. Back in those days, there was not that many creature decks. So you could play stasis, you could play Teferi kind of like for value and just kind of like expect him not to necessarily be contested on board all that often or as often as he would be now, where it's a disaster now because of Tymna and Najeela and Kroms just kind of, coming out of nowhere and smacking him around. But back in those days, you could play your Teferi, you could use your sleight of hand and kind of like actually grind a little bit of value with him. You could ramp with him before actually committing to the combo. And then the partner nation attacked and that deck kind of became like, oh, okay, I have to only play him when I'm playing Chain Veil. And that was sort of the long, slow descent of Teferi. But for a long time, you could use him as a perfectly serviceable stasis deck. And I think from that point on, there's sort of like a pretty big lull with partners in terms of like stasis exploration, with the exception of a deck that I actually brewed at the time, being the Derevi nut that I was for a long period of time. I brewed a Thrasios Tymna stasis deck, which, the madman. Yeah, which played, Derevi, which played like a lot of the parity breakers in the 98. And, you know, this was looking to be a very aggressive, sort of like Staxy prison-oriented deck with like infinite mana combos, with like freed from the real, excuse me. Also playing like whatever rule of law effects that it could, and kind of just getting there with Tymna, Hate Bears. So, you know, to some extent, it was the blue version of Bloodpod, and you know, to that extent, you know, I even called it Bloodless Podless as kind of like an homage.
Oh my gosh.
Because there's no blood moon, so it was bloodless.
You are the worst.
And there was no pod, so it was podless. But you know, it also had different names, you know, like Bird Weaver, which was an homage, I think, to the fact that, you know, there was like the Bear Weaver deck of the day, which was like a Tymna Thrasios, you know, Hate Bear deck using, like I said, if I'm not mistaken, that was the name of the Flash Hulk deck. That played stacks, but here we were, you know, going even further into stacks and a little bit less far into good win conditions. And so that was some of the exploration, you know, around Stasis, you know, when we were kind of all just brewing whatever Thrasios Tymna deck we could, you kind of got to a point in Flash Winter where like brewing just felt like a futile exercise of like, oh, you know, like I might as well just brew this thing because I can. But like ultimately at the end of the day, like if I'm taking this seriously, I should be playing Flash Hulk. But you know, we did what we could with what we had. So that was a fun deck for a while, and you know, really a great fun deck if you enjoyed drawing cards and never winning, which, you know, certainly has its fair amount of fanboys and fangirls and others, if I had to imagine. I
think that Stacks has largely fallen out of favor for two reasons.
Are you talking about like now or in that period that I referred to?
Both.
Okay.
So I think that the thing that killed it first was Flash.
Right.
And the fact that you had a 2-mana win con. So people didn't need to do too much work to be able to hold up 2 mana.
Right.
And so Winter Orb, Stasis, you know,
Trinisphere, like
all that stuff became ineffectual. And
they became worse because they kind of like in a lot of situations protected the Flash player.
Right. They worked to help the Flash player because Flash player only needs to cast one spell.
And, you know, if there's a rule of law in play, if everyone else casts a spell, you just cast Flash on top of it and they can't even respond.
Right. But when Flash got banned, the thing that still I think to this day keeps it from being a viable strategy or maybe a fruitful strategy is Dockside or Extortionist.
Yeah.
Where, you know, just the same that Blood Moon is not really equitable given the saturation of Dockside in the metagame.
Right.
For the existence of that card, attacking the land mana base is generally going to be a pretty low value because people can just skirt right over it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Dockside Extortionist is such a major get for decks that would fight against the sort of the traditional like tax and like lock-based stacks decks. You know, the type of decks I would be playing Trinispheres and things like Tangle Wire and stuff like that. I played a game recently, in fact, against an Oswald deck, you know, mono white, and I ended up being able to resolve a instant speed ad nauseum on the Oswald players. It was on their end step, but they had put a Trinisphere into play, if I'm not mistaken. And I ended up doing it with like 2 Spirit Guides, so I only had 3 mana available to me. And so they were, you know, anticipating Oh, no, hold on. There was actually two situations. There's two separate games, and I'm conflating the two. But it's even worse than that, and it really illustrates how stupid Dockside is. So there is that one where for 5 mana at instant speed, I managed to cast an Ad Nauseam into a Deafening Silence, and there was also a Tangle Wire in play. So then I untap, bounce the Deafening Silence with the Tangle Wire trigger on the stack, cast a Worldly Tutor for Dockside with my last mana, and then I just played like land Lotus Petal, played Dockside, and had all the mana I needed, even through like multiple pieces of stacks and like needing to answer the stacks pieces like in my upkeep.
Right.
Like that's example number one. Example number two was I actually deflecting swatted Appear into the Abyss. So the Oswald player was like, oh, I'm going to put Trinisphere into play to try to keep you from winning. Because I actually had like just cast Najeela. So I was untapping with 2 lands and a Mana Dork. And he puts the Trinisphere into play. And then I just play Dockside and win with Thassa's Oracle Consult. So yeah, you get the combination of Dockside producing stupid amounts of mana through a Trinisphere, but then also the efficiency of Thassa's Oracle Consult as a win condition, where if you can make like 6 mana after having drawn all those cards, then you know you're just winning even through the Trinisphere. So yeah, absolutely, I agree that the nickel and dime like stacks approach has certainly fallen out of favor because of that. And Stasis, it certainly falls into that camp. That being said, if we look at, I would say like the last holdout, so to speak, of Stasis, which would be, the Yorn deck, that deck breaks parity quite well on Stasis because of all the snowlands and because of Yorn himself being a snow permanent. But then also is not necessarily that dedicated to stacks and prison, right? Like it plays a few of those pieces, but is still just like a bug deck capable of like actually closing out the game. So, it's not at all like the prison decks of Yor. And that's sort of like where we, like you sort of illustrated Cobblepott. That's sort of where we've ended up, where you can't be playing that hardcore prison strategy anymore. You need to actually, if you're going to play stacks, you can, but you need, and you can even to some extent be playing some of those, taxing stacks effects to slow down the game. But you also need to have a win condition.
Rule of law.
And you need to have harder stacks as well, to back it up. You're kind of looking to get some other form of value from those, let's say like lighter stacks pieces in the face of Dockside, or using them to, attack very particular types of decks, like perhaps like a Thrasios Tymna mid-range deck that might be at the table, that might be less equipped to fight through that type of effect. But ultimately, you need to mostly be using it as a tempo piece or as tempo pieces so that you can execute a more proactive game plan.
Agreed.
And I think that's sort of a brief history, as brief as anything we can do as a content creation group. A brief history of Stasis.
The briefest thing that the Mind Sculptors have at their disposal.
Yeah.
The next question, I'm going to direct this over at Cobblepott, is from our good friend Mikey. Mikey is asking, in the world of efficient win cons, when and why did Doomsday fall out of favor? I've been a big proponent of the card and have gotten some people to revisit it, but in general, people seem to be against it. For what it's worth, I am also one of those people who are against it. But Cobble, when and why did Doomsday fall out of favor?
It's been a slow progression over a long period of time. I think that, and this is just my opinion, but I think that there's a couple things that are strikes against Doomsday that when compared to the other tools that are available, it just isn't worth the slot. So it used to be that, Doomsday was kind of your premier way to win with a Labman effect, because it was very high risk to, try to do demonic consultation and draw a card while protecting your Labman and, that kind of thing. I mean, for what it's worth, Doomsday itself is very risky as well. So the two main things are Thassa's Oracle existing, which takes all the risk out of the Oracle plus Consult or Tainted Pact plan, where you get the Oracle trigger on the stack, and if your demonic consultation resolves, then you win. If somebody interacts with it, then you're fine, unless somebody has an instant speed way to make you draw in between resolving in between the resolution of those two effects. So it's a very safe and low risk way of winning, and it's very efficient. Comparing that to Doomsday, you have something where, once you resolve Doomsday,
you're all in at that point.
Yes. And people are happy to let you resolve Doomsday and then interact with you as you're trying to win from there. And once you're committed and get disrupted, then
it's game over. There's no recovery.
Exactly. So it's a very high risk investment, and it's a lot less efficient because you need to have more cards. You need to have you got to have a cantrip in hand. You have to have certain cards in your deck that maybe aren't high card quality. And for what it's worth, it needs to be said that it's a complex win condition. And it's one of those things where, if things aren't just so, and you need to kind of think on your feet to put together a pile on the spot that's different from maybe the one that you have, wrote in memory, it's easy to mess up. And plenty of people who are skilled players have messed it up, when put in, when they're trying to work through interaction, or, use cards that are other than the cards that they normally use, and so on. Whereas if you're looking at Thassa's Oracle and Consultation, there's no way to mess it up, and it's lower risk, and it's more effective and more efficient. So I think that Doomsday has just kind of taken the exit because there's not really a compelling reason to slot it when you can just do Oracle and Consultation and use the slots that you would have committed to Doomsday for more protection.
Yeah, this is what exactly. I just thank you, Cobble. Thank you. That
being said, it's an interesting question to ask, because Doomsday is currently, one of, if not the best decks in Legacy. You could argue that Blue Red Delver and the various Delverless Delver now. The various Ragavan decks are perhaps better if you're looking at the fair axis.
Excuse you, Dragon Rage Channeler decks.
A lot of them are not playing Dragon's Rage Channeler. They're playing
really.
Yeah. So there's kind of it's a digression, but there's two packages. You can have the 4 Ragavan, 4 Dragon's Rage Channeler decks, or you can have the 4 Ragavan, 2 Murktide Regents, and sometimes you also get a Stoneforge package as well, which would kind of take the place of the Dragon's Rage Channelers.
Right.
So yeah, there's like multiple packages, but like the consistent one is the monkey. But
the monk,
yeah. But in any case, Doomsday, very successful deck in Legacy. Particularly in the online metagame. Also a very successful deck in the Vintage metagame currently. Considered to be one of, if not the best combo decks in that format. I think there's a few reasons for this, and I think probably the biggest one is having access to 4 Dark Rituals helps a lot.
Yep.
Having access to more copies of Brainstorm, more copies of Ponder, more copies of Preordain probably helps a lot. Having that kind of consistency.
I mean, that's it, right? Like,
no, I think the more dominant reason is 1v1 versus 1v3.
Yeah. Okay.
So you have a much higher density of people interacting with you when you're playing multiplayer. So your chances of getting disrupted are much higher because you have to fight through 3 different people instead of just one other person. So if you're not working, under a silence effect or something, your risk is way higher because there's a much higher likelihood that someone has something to stop you. And when you get to that point, then you're out of luck.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure about that, though, because it's possible to make very well protected piles, right? Like you can certainly have protection in your piles, and then when are people interacting with you? Like at certain places, like for example your cantrip and stuff like that, but they're not places that put you dead in the water.
Right, but you're also just dead to Kenrith making you draw a card, right? Like it's.
I mean,
it's just so weak to so many levels of interaction.
That's true for Thassa's Oracle Consultation.
Right.
I mean, yes, but the point of that though is that you aren't. By the time they're doing that, you've already resolved your spell. Like of I'm going all the way, and they've got you at this one point. Whereas with Doomsday, like,
well, Doomsday's a 1-card win condition, right? Like,
I mean, never mind.
You do need a cantrip. I suppose
your point makes
right?
sense. Yeah,
you do need a cantrip, and in a lot of cases, you can replace the cantrip by like having Tymna in play, or like some other source of draw. And the amount of like bad cards that you have to play to really make it work is like not so high. In the grand scheme of things, like maybe Gush. Otherwise, you're playing like cantrips. You probably already want.
I don't even think Gush is that bad of a card, though.
Exactly. I mean, and especially in Vintage, it's not a bad card. It's a restricted card because you draw 2 and you get to make a land drop. So sometimes it's like a draw 3, and like you get your land drop, but not considered a fantastic card these days in cEDH because setting yourself back on lands is considered more of a liability. And I'm going to return to this point of 4-ofs and like differences in the cards that you have access to. It's a bigger liability because we don't have as much access to free counter magic. We don't have as much access to free spells. And, we tend to need more mana to do things than you would.
I do think though, with Gush, an important piece to this though, is with the prevalence of ad nauseum, wanting to lower your average CMC plays a bigger role in that than anything else.
Like hugely overstated, I would say. Like we're at the point where you can pull off ad nauseums like with 5 drops in your deck, no problem. Like people are, I don't know. I don't know if it's entirely memes, but people are playing Peer into the Abyss. But people are playing, like Consecrated Sphinx in their
right.
ad nauseum decks now.
But we're talking about different level quality, like the type of hit that you're playing from a Consecrated Sphinx, right, is a much more high quality in quotation marks card, maybe, or more powerful card overall, right? Than
it is like
where Gush is
6 mana to play it,
right?
And it's not.
But that's my point.
It is a 1-card win condition, but it's kind of slow and like it's risky. It's like it's not so clear cut in that respect.
Well, my point though is that the floor on the value, right? Of, man, we're so fucking off topic, but I don't even care. The floor value of a consecrated Sphinx is, in my opinion, about just as high as Gush is, right? And it's 1 pip more. And so the floor value for a Gush is, I'm down 2 lands and I draw 2 cards, right? And so, and I have to hit 5 potentially off of Ad Nauseam. That doesn't seem worth it. And so, whereas with you hit it, you're willing to take that shot on a consecrated Sphinx or something big that makes a big impact. But Gush, I don't think makes a big enough impact on a game to justify a 5 CMC slot. That's kind of my point.
I mean, that may be, but you know, like I think decks like that play plenty of cards that don't necessarily have a massive impact and are kind of used just for synergy with other cards or just overall deck synergy. But you know, back to the point. I think another very salient thing that makes Doomsday worse than cEDH is just the fact that if you look historically at what Doomsday was doing, you know, and even in decks like Jaleva, you know, even in decks like Zur to some extent, a lot of the time that card was a payoff for Ad Nauseam. And like those decks were not actually like storming all that often, in fact. You know, for as much as it was touted to be like a storm deck, until Aetherflux Reservoir was printed, like it was like actually relatively hard to get there like by storming in those decks. And so you would often just Ad Nauseam and then like make mana to cast Doomsday. And then like you had mana and you had protection and you had cantrips and you would get there that way. So like Doomsday again was something that, you know, you could use as a 1-card win condition, but it wasn't 100% exactly that, obviously, because it has other requirements. You would occasionally just fire it off by itself. That's fine. You know, it did do the thing, but was sort of, in some senses, just like an inclusion that you needed to have to make sure that you could get there post Ad Nauseam. What do we have that does that now? Well, we have Underworld Breach, right? So like if you're casting Ad Nauseam as sort of your big, massive card advantage spell, sort of as a win condition, but not as a finisher, you know, would you play Doomsday or would you just play Underworld Breach, right? I think Underworld Breach ends up being the superior card in almost every circumstance. So like, it's very hard to imagine going back to Doomsday in particular, and especially in decks with access to red now.
I feel like, and I was going to say this earlier, I feel like Doomsday decks, because Cobble, you mentioned this earlier, is that, you know, you're kind of vulnerable to that interaction unless you're underneath of a silence. And this is kind of how I feel about the Chain of Smog combo as well, is I don't think that they're playable. Let me rephrase that. They are playable. I don't think they are good recommendations that I would make for your deck without white. Both of them are, personally, because I think those are both win conditions that do really well when there is a Grand Abolisher or a Ranger Captain or a Silence to protect that attempt to win the game.
Which are all doable, right? Like,
right.
You can have Cantrip, Silence, and Doomsday for 5 mana, which is like not quite as efficient in terms of mana, perhaps or in terms of like pips as like just, I don't know, Ad Nauseam, or like Thassa's Oracle, where presumably you would want to have like protection, you know, plus Thassa's Oracle plus whatever. But, you know, the cantrip can be substituted by like a wide variety of cards. And the Doomsday itself is just like 1 card as opposed to needing a 2-card win condition. So like, there is like, you know, there's some nuance there to be discussed.
Right.
I'm not like super pro Doomsday, but like, I do think that it's something that should be explored again to some extent, and people are probably not exploring it I wouldn't say nearly enough, but like, because people are not exploring it like at all.
That's not entirely true. Like Deeks,
I mean, there's not a strong incentive for people to explore it when you've got Oracle consultation.
Yeah. I do think though that the card is generally strong enough that it warrants a second look. Let's put it that way.
Sure.
So this kind of leads us into our final question, which was submitted by user Pantomime X. And Pantomime asks, and I'm going to direct this at you, Pongo, as better cards get printed and old archetypes get shelved for being outdated or slow, we end up losing interesting play patterns and stack abuse, such as Shroom flirting with the legend rule or Gerard with Phyrexian Devour, for lack of a better win con, and of course, Boonweaver Carador for existing. Which of the classic decks do you miss playing with or against, and which cards would have to be printed to bring these cards back to cEDH relevance?
Yeah, I'm going to keep this one relatively quick, because we kind of just talked about it to a wide extent. So naturally, I think this will come as no surprise to anyone. I would love to see like the prison style decks be playable again. I especially Derevi, in its prison-y form, I should say, because Derevi is playable as more of a tempo deck these days. But like that whole dynamic of playing these super intricate stacks and prison lines, and all the things that Derevi brings to the table in terms of utility, in terms of like options for doing things pre-combat, and post-combat once you've netted all Derevi's triggers, and like playing around certain forms of interaction by like doing things post-combat when you can force the interaction because of Derevi's tap ability. Like that was some of the most intricate and fun cEDH I've ever played. And it would take a metagame where the combo decks are not nearly as efficient, and are more reliant on sort of like the classic tech that they used to play, like big storm turns through Aetherflux Reservoir and like Doomsday lines, where things get super awkward when you need to pay extra mana because of tax effects, and like you might even get shut out because of like draw hate and stuff like that. There's no single card, unfortunately, I think that could get printed that would ever bring that archetype back. You would have to see a massive amount of bans, because the format has gotten so much faster and more efficient and powerful. Win cons have gotten so much more resilient to that type of hate. Thassa's Oracle, one big difference it has from Doomsday is that it only requires you to cast one non-creature spell. And so if you were ever planning on playing Thalia and Thorn of Amethyst and Glow Rider, I mean, like it's not taxing it's not taxing Thassa's Oracle at any point, right? And then the Demonic Consultation, well, I can pay 6 mana to win. Like I'm okay with that. It's fine. Like, because no one else is responding to my win condition at that point with like 3 tax effects in play.
Right.
So like, good job, nerd. But like, that's the thing, right? Like those were probably some of the most intricate games of cEDH. And I think cEDH back then as a format, and I don't know, maybe Cobblepott will agree with me, I think that the format was harder overall back then to play, because things were not ever as clear cut in terms of like what you needed to do, in terms of like how you were winning, and in terms of like the strength of your win conditions compared to the available options of interaction opponents might have. Really, we just kind of struggled to get things together because the win conditions were way less clear cut.
Right.
I definitely agree. I would say that the amount of work that you had to put in to actually win was so much higher than it is now. That, I mean, when you didn't have access to Aetherflux Reservoir, didn't have access to Underworld Breach, didn't have access to Thassa's Oracle or Laboratory Maniac, getting to a win, where you needed to use tendrils to kill the table, or some way of permanently locking the table down,
or even Doomsday, and then it is harder.
Or right,
yeah,
Doomsday without Labman is doable, but very hard. All of those things are, how do you win? Because right now, it's if someone says, what's your win con, it's trivial to, well, this is my win con. This is the thing that wins. Whereas in those days, I mean, either your commander was the thing that kind of dictated. It's like, well, I'm doing Prosh with Food Chain. It's like, okay, that is a deck defined win condition. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what you saw more of in those days, was your win condition was kind of implied by the deck that you chose. Oh, I'm running Animar, so I'm going to do Imperial Recruiter loops, and I'm going to, bring myself down to almost no life with Phyrexian.
The Metamorph.
Yeah. And that kind of stuff. There was a lot more effort that was required to put wins together. I would say I also agree that the thing that I miss most, and this might be surprising, is not Corridor, but Brago. I was a big fan of Brago when it was a powerful deck, and there is nothing that feels better than just having a Tezzeret that gets a static orb and a Tangle Wire in the same turn, and just putting the table into this state where everyone says, okay, you don't need to do anything more. And those days are long gone. And if there's really nothing that's short of banning Dockside and some part of the Oracle combo to ever, bring us hope of being able to go.
Oracle.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just softly cheering for
Oracle. You know what's funny?
Over here.
I actually played at the LGS for the first time recently in a very long time, and there was I guess I would say a casual player, fighting the good fight to get Thassa's Oracle banned, because he was going around playing against casual players, winning on turn 2 with Oracle Consult in his otherwise casual deck with Mirari's Wake.
Jeez.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And
Vorinclex, yeah. So, I
guess that's one way of doing
it. Fighting the good fight.
Right.
Oh, man. Don't worry. I'll just keep yelling about it. Well, that really seems to wrap things up for us today. It's been really interesting. It's been very cool to sit here and listen to you guys talk about the olden days. Well, and like I said, I really didn't really get into cEDH fully until really like 2017. And so like I had played Modern and Standard and all those things all the time before that. And I was, aware of stuff like Chain Veil Teferi because I played against it all the time. But I didn't really know what cEDH was and that there was a community until really like 2017. And that's when all of that kind of started for me. So it's very interesting to hear about what it was like before that. But thank you guys. It's been great getting back into the studio with you. What are some final thoughts on the community then? And I'm going to toss this to Cobble of where the format is and how you feel about the direction the format's going in.
I think that the format is healthy, even with Oracle Consult being the boogeyman that it is, saturating the metagame. I think that the format is in a place where you can, if you're doing rule of law, you can do stacks, you can do all-in ad nauseam, you can do more mid-range strategies. There's a lot of different avenues to explore each of those archetypes.
You can play Lavinia.
You could.
Should you?
There's your one per episode. But
I didn't mention it in the Pleasant Kenobi episode, so
okay.
We broke the streak.
You're growing. But I think that the trajectory is moving in a good direction, both from a card pool standpoint and from a optics standpoint, as far as the community being able to communicate with the other communities within EDH and kind of coexist harmoniously. I think that the developments that have been taking place over the past 2 years have been very positive.
Yeah. Pongo, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree. I think that coming out of Flash Winter, the metagame feels a lot more balanced, like I said, with some of those rock, paper, scissors characteristics to it. Brewing has kind of become fun again, which is always good. And, I think that, with any luck, we'll probably see a bit of a toning down of the power level of new cards coming out. So we won't have quite as much chaos with some new cards being printed, absolutely blowing the format apart and, recreating it all over again. That being said, Modern Horizons 3 coming probably in 2 years. So maybe want to be a little bit too careful about what I say. Overall, it sounded like I was being down on the format before by saying that, back in my day, things were so much more fun. Things were so much better. But, I don't actually think that's totally true. It's just a style of gameplay that I miss. And we have new styles of gameplay that are interesting in and of themselves, that I thoroughly enjoy. So I think that the format is in a good place. We'll see if Cody has anything to say about that, but
Cody did some damage at Tier 1 Con.
but I suppose we shall see.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look purely by the MLC, ad nauseam is in a terrible place. But thank you all for joining us today. And just a quick reminder before we head out, you can follow us and get updates on the show and all the projects we're working on if you're on Twitter at SculptyBoys, BOIS, or you can find a direct link to all of our different locations or Mox fields, all of our individual Twitters in the description below. Want to also give an extra shout out and thanks to all of our patrons who help keep the lights on. You can head over to patreon.com/the Mind Sculptors, or you can check out the link in the description. Thank you all again for joining us this week, and from all of us here at the Mind Sculptors, I'm Callahan, and we'll see you next time.
I'm in line with the stars, I'm in sync with the earth. 10 toes deep, flower child from the turf. I never switch sides, like even when I die, I'm a ride for the squad, ladder ties in the hearse. I've been on the vibe, kinda hard to describe. I'm in between, I'm good and it's fine, but I'm tired of the grind. Then I come alive in the night to realize I'm in the middle of the time of my life. I never so packed for the stack, never lied on the rap, got a bag from the way that I write it. Queen looking Tyson, do that ass survive, doing 80 to the house, then I hit it to the sky change. Haters on a tirade, talking to the crib in the face, be still like I hate stuff fade. We all want the same, we all want a meal in the safe, I wanna live like I'm trying to reach enlightenment. my lips feel bent from the bib. Take a sip till I pass out. Try and get grip,